You find yourself within the thick, silent walls of a medieval castle. The year could be 1250, or perhaps 1350. The centuries blur together in a time when the castle stood not as a symbol of romance, but as a necessity for survival. Its towers and keeps were raised in stone, not for beauty, but for protection, for endurance, and for permanence. And yet, as solid as these walls appear, they do little against one of the oldest enemies of humankind, the cold. The stone itself becomes its own adversary in winter. These great blocks of grey limestone or granite, hewn from quarries at enormous expense, could withstand a battering ram or catapult fire, but they absorbed the frost of winter like a sponge. By evening, the walls gave back that chill in waves, seeping into every chamber, into the very marrow of those who lived within. For a knight, whose body was accustomed to the rigors of battle and the demands of campaigning, the cold inside the castle could feel as harsh as the battlefield. When you picture a knight, you may imagine shining armor, banners, and the clash of swords, yet every knight, however grand in the lists, had to lay down his head at night. And in winter, especially in northern Europe, the act of sleeping could itself become an ordeal. Castles, despite their massive size, offered little comfort. The windows were narrow slits, designed not to welcome sunlight or warmth, but to keep out arrows. Glass, when it existed at all, was a luxury reserved for kings and cathedrals, not for the chambers of knights. Most windows were open to the wind, blocked only with wooden shutters, and these rarely fit tightly. The wind would snake its way through the smallest cracks, carrying with it the dampness of the night air. The great halls, where many knights and retainers might sleep, were vast and draughty. Even when fires were kept burning at the center, the heat never reached the corners. The smoke would rise to the high rafters, leaving the air below cold, sometimes biting, and often filled with a bitter scent of wood and soot. So how then did a knight prepare for the night? The answer begins with the bed, and the truth is far less romantic than the four-poster splendor you may imagine. Beds were wooden frames, often crude, though in the chambers of wealthier knights they might be carved. Upon these were laid ropes, stretched tightly across to form a base. On top of that would be a mattress, stuffed not with feathers, unless one was extremely fortunate, but with straw, rushes, or coarse wool. These needed to be replaced often, for they grew mouldy and infested with insects. The familiar phrase, "sleep tight," in fact comes from the need to keep these bedropes taut, for if they sagged, the mattress dipped into a hollow, robbing the sleeper of even that meager comfort. The coverings were just as important. A knight would layer himself with woolen blankets, coarse linens, or, if his household was prosperous, heavy furs. Deer hide, wolf pelt, or sheepskin were prized for warmth. Yet these were not always available in abundance, and many relied on a single heavy cloak, the same one used in battle or in travel, drawn tightly around the shoulders through the night. And even then, warmth was not guaranteed. In accounts from the period, there are mentions of men rising in the night to pace the floors, stamping their feet and moving their limbs to keep the blood flowing. Others would sleep near the hearth, sometimes dangerously close, where sparks might catch on bedding. Knights did not always sleep alone. Servants, squires, and retainers often shared sleeping spaces, if not beds themselves. It was common for 2 or more men to share a mattress, not for comfort, but for the preservation of body heat. In the great hall, entire households might sleep side by side, the air filled with the sound of breathing, of muffled coughs, of the restless turning of bodies wrapped in rough cloth. Yet, for all these discomforts, knights endured. And here lies a truth often overlooked. The life of a knight was not merely one of glory or grandeur. It was a life lived under constant compromise, where survival demanded resilience as much as courage. To sleep through a medieval winter's night was itself a form of endurance. Now, imagine the walls around you thick with frost, your bed little more than straw upon wood, the only warmth a patchwork of furs and cloaks. Outside the wind rattles at the shutters, and beyond the castle walls the land lies in deep silence, broken only by the distant howl of wolves. You curl tighter, seeking warmth that the stone refuses to give, and wonder if the fire in the hall will last until dawn. But how, you might ask, did knights' households, their families, their servants, their squires, adapt differently to the cold? And what did the rhythm of the castle itself do to shape how sleep was managed in the harshest nights of the year?
When we think of castles, we often imagine them as bustling, noisy places. In truth, the rhythm of life within their walls slowed dramatically after sundown. The fading of the sun signaled more than darkness. It brought with it a subtle transformation, where activity dwindled, voices softened, and the priority turned toward warmth and rest. But warmth was neither easy to find nor easy to maintain. The great enemy was fuel. Firewood, though abundant in some regions, was often scarce in others. Forests near castles had long been stripped by constant harvesting. Even in well-managed estates, firewood had to be gathered, cut, dried, and stored in enormous quantities to survive a single winter. Oak, prized for its heat, was often reserved for the kitchens or the lord's private chambers. Ash burned more cleanly and was easier to split, and so it often found its way into the hearths of knights and their households. But as the cold deepened, even the simplest branches became precious. Squires and servants bore the burden of tending these fires. For a knight, the hours of the day were already filled with duties: training, managing estates, attending to their liege. At night, it was the younger and lower-ranking members of the household who ensured that embers were stirred, that logs were placed carefully on the flames, and that the fires lasted until morning. Many slept lightly, rising at intervals to feed the hearth. Others rested curled upon the rush-strewn floors near the warmth, their ears attuned to the crackle of flame and the whistle of draughts. The hall, where much of the household might sleep, was dominated by this central fire. Its glow created a small oasis of comfort in all otherwise a frigid room. Yet the heat reached only so far. Those who found themselves pushed to the edges of the chamber slept in deeper cold, huddled in cloaks or in shared bedding. The contrast was stark. At the center, the warmth of glowing embers. At the margins, the bite of winter air seeping through stone and shutter. Knights who held private chambers fared better, though only by degree. These rooms might contain smaller hearths, but their size meant they cooled quickly when the flames burned low. To leave a fire untended was to wake in a room so cold that breath hung in the air like mist. Servants, squires, and retainers were more accustomed to such discomforts. Many grew up in peasant cottages where cold was simply a fact of life. Their resilience was born from necessity. They shared sleeping spaces, layering themselves in whatever materials they had: woolen cloaks, patched blankets, even straw piled high to act as insulation. For the knight, accustomed to battle, hardship was a mark of training. For the servant, it was survival itself. But the act of sleeping was not purely physical. The mind, too, bore the weight of the cold. Medieval people were deeply attuned to the cycles of the seasons. Winter nights were long, sometimes stretching to 16 hours of darkness in the northern regions. Sleep, therefore, often came in phases. Historical accounts and studies of medieval patterns suggest a first sleep and second sleep. A knight, like his servants, might rest for several hours after dusk, wake in the middle of the night to tend fires, pray, or even converse, and then return to slumber until dawn. This broken rhythm was not seen as unusual, rather it was woven into the fabric of life. In the middle hours, the household stirred quietly. You might hear the shuffling of feet, the low crackle of fires being stoked, the murmur of prayers from the chapel, where monks or chaplains kept vigil. Knights themselves sometimes used this interval for reflection or to ensure that their retainers kept their watch. The watchmen, those stationed upon the walls or in the gatehouses, endured the cold most of all. Their duties allowed no luxury of thick blankets or fur. Instead, they wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks, stamping their feet against the frost, carrying torches or lanterns that gave little warmth. Their eyes strained into the dark, not only against enemies, but against the vast silence of the winter landscape. The knowledge that others slept, wrapped in relative safety, did little to ease their hardship. Within the chambers, smaller details shaped the experience of sleep. Beds were not merely straw and wood. They were sometimes surrounded by heavy curtains, not for ornament, but for warmth. These hangings created a pocket of still air, protecting the sleeper from draughts. Within this enclosed space, a knight might draw his furs tightly and feel, for a few hours, a fragile sanctuary from the cold. The smells of the castle lingered as well, the sharp tang of smoke from the hearth, the mustiness of damp straw, the faint odor of sweat and wool. These were not unpleasant to medieval sensibilities. Rather, they were familiar, the constant companions of a life lived in close quarters. For many, such scents were woven into the idea of home and safety. And yet, the threat of discomfort was always near. Bedbugs, lice, and fleas thrived in the straw mattresses. They disturbed sleep, leaving behind itchy welts that compounded the misery of cold nights. Records speak of household rules that required bedding to be shaken out, straw to be replaced, and rushes to be renewed. Yet no household was free of pests entirely. Even the wealthiest knight's chamber was a place where sleep could be broken by such intrusions. It is tempting, perhaps, to think that hardship alone defined the night. But there were also small comforts. A shared jug of warmed ale before bed, spiced if the household was wealthy enough to. A loyal hound lying near the fire, its body offering warmth to its master. The sound of familiar voices settling into quiet murmurs before the hush of sleep overtook them. These things softened the edge of the cold, turning survival into routine. Still, one cannot escape the truth. To live and sleep in a medieval castle was to wrestle with the elements. Each night was a negotiation with discomfort, a careful balancing of fire, clothing, bedding, and body heat. The knight endured, as did his household, not because the environment was kind, but because resilience was demanded at every turn. And so we end this first part of our journey. You have now walked through the halls of a medieval castle on a winter night. You have seen the knight retreat to his straw bed, felt the draught through shuttered windows, watched squires rise to stoke the fire, and heard the muffled sounds of the household at rest. You have sensed the tension between warmth and cold, comfort and hardship, survival and sleep. But one question remains unresolved. If such conditions were endured night after night, how did this way of life shape the very nature of knighthood itself? Did the discipline of enduring the cold prepare them for battle, or did it wear them down, little by little, in ways we cannot now measure?
When you picture a medieval castle in winter, you may imagine a place of stone and silence, its towers rising into a dark sky heavy with frost. Yet inside those walls, life followed a pattern, a rhythm that repeated itself night after night, winter after winter. The act of preparing for sleep was never casual. It was ritual, shaped by necessity, steeped in habits born of centuries of hardship. The knight himself did not simply collapse into his bed after a long day. He prepared, because preparation was survival. The first task was always fire. As the sun sank, the hearth was lit, if it had not burned throughout the day already. The flames were carefully tended, for a poorly set fire meant a miserable night. Logs had to be placed at the correct angle, embers pushed forward to catch, and sometimes a bellows was brought out to feed the first sparks. The squires took pride in this work, for keeping their master warm was as important as polishing armor or sharpening blades. Then came the matter of bedding. Straw mattresses were common, stuffed into coarse linen sacks. Wealthier knights might have theirs topped with wool or even down, though such luxuries were rare outside the highest nobility. The mattress itself was not enough. It was often raised upon a wooden frame to keep the sleeper off the cold stone floor, for stone absorbed chill like nothing else. On the bed were laid woolen blankets, sometimes several thick layers and furs draped above them. Yet blankets alone could not always ward off the coldest nights. To climb into bed was to feel an initial shock, the icy touch of fabric that had absorbed the day's chill. This was why some households warmed stones near the hearth, wrapping them in cloth and slipping them into the bed before their master lay down. Such small gestures transformed the act of sleep from suffering into something bearable. Before sleep, there was prayer. Medieval people lived in a world where faith and daily life were inseparable. A knight, hardened by war and bound by oaths, often ended his day with a prayer for protection through the night. In the dim light of a single candle, he might murmur words to St. George, patron of soldiers, or to St. Michael, the warrior archangel. These prayers were not merely habit, they were armor for the soul, a way of entering the vulnerable state of sleep with a measure of confidence that God's watch extended into the darkest hours. Elsewhere in the castle, others engaged in their own rituals. Servants extinguished torches in the hallways, leaving only the faint glow of lanterns where light was needed. The kitchens cooled after the day's work, though a pot might remain simmering for late-night use. Children, if present, were bundled together for warmth, often sleeping in groups rather than alone. The sounds of the castle softened. The clatter of armor ceased. The hounds, fed and curled near the fire, gave only the occasional sigh. Outside, the world grew quieter still. The muffled crunch of snow if a guard paced the walls, the distant howl of wolves beyond the gate. Yet this quiet did not mean safety. Castles were built for defense, and vigilance never slept. Night watches rotated, and men stood at posts upon the battlements, their eyes scanning for movement. These guards endured the cold in ways knights did not, their cloaks stiff with frost, their hands numb upon spears or crossbows. They stamped their feet not only to keep warm, but to stay awake. If a knight trusted his servants to tend his fire, he also trusted these men to guard his life while he slept. The knight's chamber itself was a study in contrast. The firelight flickered, casting warm shadows upon rough stone walls. Curtains around the bed kept drafts at bay, enclosing him in a private cocoon. Yet beyond that thin layer of fabric, the air remained cold, creeping into every corner. You can almost imagine him lying there, wrapped in cloak and fur, aware of every sound. The crackle of the hearth, the shuffle of a servant nearby, the whistle of the wind through a shutter not quite sealed. Sleep came in layers, not in one smooth descent. The night might drift into slumber, only to awake some hours later. This first sleep was a familiar state, accepted rather than fought. During these waking moments, he might pray again, rise to relieve himself, or even spend quiet time sharpening a blade by the firelight. The second sleep followed until dawn, a pattern so natural that people thought little of it. Only with modern times did we come to expect a single unbroken night's rest.
But one must not forget the hardships that lingered even in rest. The body carried the fatigue of training and labor. The air carried the ever-present risk of sickness, for cold weakened the body's defenses, and poorly ventilated rooms spread illness easily. Pneumonia, fevers, and coughs were feared companions of winter nights. For this reason, herbal remedies often found their way into the chamber. A servant might bring a pot of chamomile or thyme infusion, not for comfort alone, but in the hope of warding off chill-borne ailments. And then there were the vermin. No matter how wealthy the knight was, lice and fleas were relentless. They lived in mattresses, burrowed into bedding, and bit through the night. Cleanliness helped, but even the most meticulous house could not entirely escape them. To sleep was often to scratch, to endure, to accept discomfort as part of life. Still, resilience defined the knight and his household. They did not complain of these things in the way we might. For them, hardship was expected. Cold nights were no more an obstacle than long marches or heavy armor. The discipline of sleep itself was training for life. To lie in a frigid room, to endure broken rest, to rise stiff yet ready at dawn, these were unspoken lessons in fortitude. So what emerges, then, is not only the image of a man at rest, but of an entire system, a household, a community within walls, all adjusting their rhythms to the season. The knight, though central, was part of this greater fabric. His survival depended on the firewood cut by peasants, the straw replaced by servants, the watch kept by guards. Sleep, in this way, was not an individual act, but a collective achievement. And so you begin to see the castle not simply as a fortress, nor as a home of grandeur, but as a living organism that breathed with the cycles of day and night. Its heart was the fire. Its breath was the sound of those who labored within. Its dreams were shaped by the fears and hopes of its people. As you settle into this image, imagine yourself lying in that narrow bed, the fur pulled tightly around your shoulders, the firelight flickering across your vision. You know that others watch outside, that servants sleep nearby, that dawn will come slowly, pale and cold. You close your eyes, and the rhythm of medieval night enfolds you. Yet, one cannot help but wonder, how did such cold, broken sleep affect the knight when morning came? Did these nights of hardship strengthen his resolve? Or did they leave him wearied before battle and duty began?
When you imagine life in a medieval castle, it is tempting to think only of grandeur, vast stone walls, banners fluttering above towers, and banquets served upon long tables. But within those walls, when the days grew short and the nights pressed heavily, sleep was not a luxury, it was a daily battle. And in that battle, survival depended not on wealth or title alone, but on wisdom, habit, and endurance. Consider the architecture itself. Castles were designed for strength, not comfort. Their thick walls, sometimes 2 or 3 meters deep, kept out attackers, but they also kept out the sun. Even in daylight, the interior was dim and cold, and in winter, the cold seemed to seep straight from the stones themselves. A fire could soften the air in one chamber, but it could not warm the whole. Knights and their families lived with the understanding that a castle was as much a burden as it was a shield. The cold affected every part of life. At night, the temperature inside a chamber might drop to nearly match the outside air. A knight who had spent his day training in the yard, dining in the hall, and meeting with his retainers would retreat to his chamber already chilled to the bone. He wrapped himself in cloak and fur, but the stone beneath and around him radiated frost. This was not something to be fought in the modern sense. There were no roaring furnaces, no glass windows to trap heat, no thick insulation. There was only endurance. Yet knights and their households were resourceful. One common method of fighting the night chill was the use of dead curtains.
These heavy drapes, hung around a bed frame, trapped body heat and fire warmth in a smaller space. Within the curtain's folds, the temperature was a little more bearable, though still far from warm. To slip inside was to step into a private cocoon, a space where one could pretend, for a few hours, that the cold outside had been kept at bay. Another method was layering, not only with blankets, but with clothing itself. It was not unusual for a knight to sleep wearing his woolen tunic or hose. The idea of changing into night clothes was a rarity. Instead, garments were worn for days or even weeks until they could no longer be tolerated. Removing them at night meant exposing the body to bitter air. Better to remain clothed, even if it meant less comfort, than to risk the shock of freezing. You might wonder how this relentless cold affected the knight's body. The truth is, it shaped him. Bones stiffened, muscles ached. The simple act of rising in the morning was often accompanied by soreness, not only from the day's labor, but from the strain of sleeping in such harsh conditions. Illness bred easily in these environments. A cough could spread quickly through the household. Fevers were common. Even strong men fell to winter's grip, and many did not recover. Because of this, people relied heavily on remedies. Before sleep, a knight might drink a warmed ale or a spiced wine, which were believed to encourage circulation and guard against chill. Herbal brews were also common. Thyme, sage, and rosemary were thought to ward off sickness. Honey mixed with herbs soothed sore throats. In larger castles, an apothecary or wise woman might be consulted for tonics to strengthen the body before nightfall. These rituals of preparation remind us that sleep was not passive. It was an active struggle for health and survival. And then there was the psychological weight of night. Darkness was not taken for granted. With no lamps beyond flickering torches or candles, shadows stretched long and uncertain. The mind played tricks in the gloom, and many believed that the night carried dangers unseen, spirits, demons, or restless souls wandering beyond the firelight. To a knight, whose life was filled with battle and blood, these thoughts were no less real. He prayed not only for warmth, but for protection of the soul. Sleep meant lowering one's guard, and this was never done lightly. Communal life also shaped the night. Not every knight slept in solitary luxury. Many shared chambers with squires or other retainers, especially during campaigns or in less wealthy households. The sound of multiple people sleeping in one space created its own rhythm. The muffled cough, the turning of a body, the crackle of the hearth as it sank into embers. For those who lived in close quarters, warmth was sometimes shared, quite literally. Sleeping close to others reduced exposure to drafts. Survival often outweighed notions of personal space. But in the heart of the castle, where the lord and his knights resided, the night also carried dignity. The chamber, however cold, was marked with symbols of status. Tapestries upon the wall, not only for decoration, but as insulation. Chests filled with cloaks and blankets, weapons resting near hand, polished by firelight. Even at rest, the knight's world was defined by hierarchy and duty. The comfort he found, limited though it was, came from the labor of others. Peasants who felled trees for firewood, servants who fetched water, squires who set the chamber in order. The question of armor must also be considered. Contrary to the image you might hold, knights did not sleep in armor. To do so would have been unbearable, especially in winter, when the metal grew icy. Armor was carefully stored on stands or chests at night. But weapons remained close, for a castle could be attacked at any hour. A sword might rest against the bed frame, a dagger within arm's reach. This was the balance of medieval sleep, vulnerability to the cold on one hand, readiness for danger on the other. It is worth pausing here to imagine the scene fully. A chamber lit by a low fire. A man lying upon a straw mattress, wrapped in wool and fur. Curtains drawn tight around his bed. the faint glow of embers seeping through. Beyond the curtains, the sound of guards pacing upon the walls, their boots echoing against stone. A distant dog barks, then silence. The knight breathes slowly, adjusting to the cold, his body relaxing only when weariness outweighs discomfort. This was night in a castle, a mixture of harshness and security, of faith and fatigue. Yet it is something remarkable in how ordinary these hardships became. For the medieval knight, such nights were not exceptional. They were life itself, repeated season after season, year after year. What seems extraordinary to us, the idea of enduring such bitter sleep, was for them simply part of being alive. Still, one cannot help but reflect. Did this constant exposure to hardship forge resilience, or did it wear them down in ways we cannot measure? The bones of medieval men often show signs of arthritis, of strain and injury carried through life. Was this not, in part, the legacy of nights spent stiff and shivering, rising each morning to duties unrelenting? As we close this section, you can almost hear the embers settling in the hearth, the faint sigh of a man drifting into his second sleep. The cold is never truly gone, but his body learns to endure it, as countless before him had done. And this endurance, this ability to live with discomfort, was perhaps the quietest but strongest weapon a knight ever possessed. But here another question arises, and it lingers with us as night lingers over stone towers. How did the rhythm of such nights shape the larger culture of knighthood and the values that defined it?
When we think of knights, we often imagine them in the full blaze of daylight, armor glinting, banners raised, horses pawing the ground. Yet, as much as daylight shaped their duties, night defined their survival. In truth, a knight's relationship with sleep was not simply about rest. It was a test of patience, of discipline, and of living by a code that extended even into the hours of darkness. The medieval world held sleep in rhythms unlike our own. Today, most of us think in terms of one long stretch of rest, 8 hours, beginning in the evening and ending with the morning sun. But knights, like peasants and lords alike, often followed what historians call segmented sleep. After the day's work, they would lie down in the early evening, wrapped against the cold, and drift into what was called the first sleep. This might last 3 to 4 hours until midnight or slightly beyond. Then came a period of wakefulness. The castle at this time was hushed but not silent. Guards patrolled the walls, the wind pushed against arrow slits, and sometimes the cries of animals rose from the courtyard. Within chambers, men and women stirred. Some prayed, some tended the fire. Some even conversed quietly with those beside them. This interval between first and second sleep was seen not as an interruption, but as natural, even useful. For knights, it carried meaning. Many used these hours for prayer, to kneel in the chill of the chamber, whispering Latin verses while the rest of the household slept, was a kind of discipline, a reminder that the knight's life was not solely his own, but bound to duty, to God, and to the code of honor he had sworn. Others used the time to sharpen weapons, to tend armor, or simply to reflect. The silence of midnight was, in a way, a forge for the mind. After this interlude came the second sleep, stretching from early morning hours until dawn. It was in this second rest that the body settled more deeply, perhaps more comfortably, until the crow of a rooster or the call of the watch signaled the day's beginning. And so, sleep for a night was divided, patterned by darkness itself. It was a rhythm dictated by survival, but also by culture, by belief, and by the practicalities of living within stone walls. The connection between discipline and rest was not incidental. To endure the cold, the noise, the hardness of bedding, these were small but constant tests. They forged a certain toughness that was essential not only for daily life but for war.
A knight who could not sleep in a freezing castle chamber would fare even worse on campaign, beneath canvas tents or open skies, where winter's breath was harsher still. Indeed, campaign nights were harsher than castle nights. Picture an army encamped in a field, snow upon the ground, the earth hard as iron beneath straw bedding. Knights slept in tents if they were fortunate, but many shared them with squires and fellow men-at-arms, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Fires flickered outside, but the smoke often choked more than it warmed. Cloaks doubled as blankets, armor was piled nearby, and weapons were never far from reach. The night's sleep here was lighter still, interrupted by fear of ambush, by the sounds of horses, or by the restless movements of men sharing the same space. What is striking is how the knight's mind adapted to such conditions. He learned not to crave luxury, but to accept discomfort as the normal state of life. The castle chamber, though cold, seemed a blessing compared to the open field. The tent, though drafty, was a shield against sleet. A bed of straw was preferable to frozen ground. Such comparisons reveal how deeply the discipline of rest shaped the knight's outlook. Comfort was never assumed, but always relative. The chivalric code itself, that moral and martial framework which guided knights, wove into this knightly endurance. Honor, courage, faith, and service, these were not only demonstrated in battle, but in how a knight endured the quieter struggles of existence. Rising faithfully for dawn prayers, keeping vigil through the midnight hours, sharing warmth with comrades rather than hoarding it. These were small acts, but they reflected the larger ideals of loyalty and humility. It is here, too, that we must recognize the role of ritual. Before sleep, many knights followed prayers, blessings, or simple gestures of devotion. To cross oneself before lying down, to murmur a psalm, to place a sword or a crucifix beside the bed, these rituals were shields of another kind. They reminded the knight that even in sleep, he remained in God's presence, watched over not only by guards, but by higher powers. To sleep without such protections was unthinkable. The night was too uncertain, too full of unseen dangers. In some orders, particularly among crusading knights like the Templars, sleep was even tightly bound to discipline. They were instructed to sleep in their armor, or at least with weapons ready, their bodies trained to rise at any moment. Such rules blurred the line between waking and resting, as if the knight must always remain half aware, half prepared, never surrendering fully to slumber. This discipline, however taxing, was seen as essential to their holy duty. Even in secular castles, echoes of this mentality persisted. A knight did not view sleep as surrender, but as preparation. To rest was to ready oneself for the labors of the next day, for the training yard, the Lord's call, or the battlefield. To oversleep or to grow soft in one's habits was to risk dishonor. Thus, even the act of closing one's eyes was touched by duty, by the awareness that life and service demanded both strength and sacrifice. But beneath this discipline, the human truth remained. Knights, like all men, longed for warmth, for comfort, for ease. The struggle to achieve rest in a freezing chamber was not romantic, it was wearying, sometimes painful, sometimes lonely. And it raises a quiet question that lingers still. How much of the knight's famed endurance was born not from heroism, but from sheer necessity? Did the cold and hardship forge greatness, or simply wear down the body until only resilience remained? This is where we must pause, for the discipline of knight is not merely a matter of routine. It is a window into how an entire class of men, warriors, lords, servants of faith, shape themselves around the rhythms of sleep, cold, and silence. And in those rhythms, we glimpse the foundations of knighthood itself. But another question remains, quietly pressing at the edges of this thought. What did these knightly struggles mean for the knight's identity, for the way he saw himself in relation to his lord, his household, and his god.
If you close your eyes now and imagine the castle again at night, you might notice how different it feels compared to the bustle of day. The great hall, once filled with the sounds of feasting, music, and speech, is now dark and still, save for the faint glow of embers dying in the hearth. Corridors echo faintly with the step of guards, their iron-shod boots striking rhythm into silence. And behind heavy wooden doors, knights and squires lie in chambers, wrapped in cloaks, breathing slowly in the cold. It is in this quiet that one begins to sense the bonds which knit the castle together. For though knights were warriors, men trained for steel and battle, they were also members of a household, and sleep, or the fight for it, became one of the threads that bound them. Few knights slept entirely alone. At the very least, there was the presence of a squire, a young man in training, often a teenager of noble birth, whose duty was to attend to his master's needs. If a knight's chamber was cold, the squire felt it too, for he often lay nearby, ready to rise at a word. By day, he polished armor and saddled horses. By night, he might keep watch, tend the fire, or even share a blanket with his master. This relationship was not merely practical, it was formative. For the squire, to watch his knight endure discomfort with stoic patience was itself a lesson in the virtues of chivalry. For the knight, to know that another was watching instilled the duty of example. Even in the weariness of midnight, in the shivering of cold limbs, a knight was never free of his role. He embodied an ideal for others to see, even when simply trying to sleep. Beyond the bond of knight and squire lay the broader household. Castles were not solitary places. They were webs of interdependence, where survival through winter depended on shared effort. Servants tended fires in the great hall. Cooks rose in the early hours to prepare bread. Guards rotated on watch. Each person had a role, and though a knight stood higher in rank, he too was bound to this rhythm. In the coldest months, households sometimes gathered in communal sleeping spaces, great halls lined with pallets where lords, retainers, and servants all rested under the same roof. The warmth of many bodies made the night more bearable. The castle itself became less a fortress of stone and more a living organism, its heartbeat felt in the rise and fall of breathing, its warmth sustained by shared presence. It is worth remembering that castles, for all their grandeur, were often drafty, damp, and imperfect. Heat rose poorly through stone. Tapestries could not fully block the chill. Windows, where they existed, were unglazed and covered with oiled cloth or shutters. In such conditions, no one was truly comfortable, and so the hierarchies of day softened slightly in the night. Though a lord might command in daylight, at midnight he too shivered just as his servants did. Cold was an equalizer. In this way, the act of rest became quietly political. To share warmth, to keep watch faithfully, to rise when called, these were gestures of loyalty, not only to a lord, but to the community of the castle itself. A knight's endurance was not just for himself, it reassured others. His calm under hardship, his ability to bear cold without complaint, reinforced the idea that the order of things was steady, dependable, and divinely sanctioned. One might even say that sleep itself became part of the performance of loyalty. For to rise early at dawn prayers, to be seen ready before the Lord, to endure nights of discomfort without shirking, these were signs that one was faithful, trustworthy, and fit to hold honor. In a world where reputation carried weight equal to steel, even the details of how one endured the night mattered. But loyalty was tested not only by cold, it was tested by fear. The medieval knight was never wholly safe. A castle might be attacked, its gates tested by raiders or rival lords.
Fire might break out in a wooden building within the walls. Disease, too, spread swiftly in close quarters, its signs often appearing in the dark hours. For this reason, knights often slept lightly, their minds half alert even in rest. Armor was kept near, swords close at hand. A faithful squire might be ordered to wake his master at the faintest sign of trouble. And here again the bonds of loyalty deepened. Trust was not a matter of words alone, but of knightly practice. A knight trusted his squire to keep watch, his comrades to guard the walls, his household to stir if danger came. Without such trust, sleep would have been impossible. In this sense, the castle at night was less a place of rest than a fragile balance, each man and woman dependent on the others. And so the cold of the chamber, the flicker of candlelight, the hush of shared breathing, all wove together into something larger, a collective survival, an unspoken pact. Yet for all this, the night was also a space of solitude. When the fires dimmed and conversation fell away, the knight was left with his own thoughts. Here lay the deeper challenge. In silence, a man confronted himself. He recalled the duties of the day, the battles fought, the sins committed, the promises kept or broken. Some nights sought comfort in prayer, clutching a crucifix or whispering psalms into the darkness. Others wrestled inwardly with doubts, fears, and memories. The night was long, and the mind could wander in troubling ways. Did his Lord truly trust him? Would his body endure another winter? Had he been faithful to his vows? These were not idle musings, but pressing concerns in a world where tomorrow was uncertain. It is perhaps here, in the solitude of a freezing night, that the knight's identity was shaped most profoundly. Armor, weapons, and battles made him visible by day, but it was in the stillness of night that he faced himself, not as a figure of chivalry or renown, but as a man shivering in the cold, dependent on God, on comrades, and on the fragile warmth of shared humanity. And so we must ask, did the bonds of loyalty and faith forged in these nights matter more than the battles of day? Was the true test of knighthood found not on the field, but in the endurance of cold, silence, and the unspoken ties that held men together in the dark?
If you imagine the castle again, quiet beneath the weight of night, you will see that it was not only the knight and his squire who felt the cold. The entire household was drawn into the same struggle. Lords and ladies in their chambers, servants near the kitchens, guards on the walls, each was engaged in the long, slow endurance of the winter night. In this way, the cold became a kind of invisible force, shaping how people lived together. A medieval castle was more than stone walls. It was a living organism. Every breath of smoke from the kitchen fire, every creak of timber in the gatehouse, every step along the battlements contributed to its life. At night, this life contracted, slowed, but never fully slept. The cold was everywhere, pressing into stone, slipping through cracks, settling into bones. Fires blazed in great holes in private chambers, but their heat rarely spread far. Beyond the circle of flame lay shadow, and in that shadow, chill. Even in a lord's chamber thick with tapestries, there was no escaping it entirely. Thus, the castle became a place where survival was communal. The knight, who may have seemed solitary by day, was in truth bound by invisible threads to everyone else who endured the same night. The peasant who chopped wood, the servant who stoked the fire, the cook who tended the embers, all made the night's sleep possible. In daylight, the hierarchy of the castle was stark. The lord commanded, the knight served, the peasant obeyed. But night altered the structure. A shivering body knew little of rank. Cold did not respect titles. It pressed against armor and rags alike. It is here
that you may notice a curious paradox. The knight, a figure of status and honor, was dependent on the most ordinary tasks. Without the fire laid by a servant, without the rushes cleaned from the floor, without the bread prepared for morning, the knight's endurance would fail. The cold made visible what daylight often concealed. The castle was a web of interdependence. This web reached far beyond the walls. The wood for fires was cut in surrounding forests, the wool for blankets spun by villagers, the food for winter feasts stored in barns. Thus, each freezing night reminded those within the castle that they were tied to a broader community. A knight's survival depended on peasants as much as peasants depended on the knight's protection. For many knights, night was not merely a time to rest, but a time to pray. Christianity shaped every corner of medieval life, and cold nights deepened its presence. Prayer was both comfort and duty. Before sleeping, a knight might kneel at a small crucifix, whispering words in Latin, sometimes stumbling over syllables he barely understood, yet believing that the act itself mattered. The hours of night were also punctuated by the rhythm of the church. Monastic bells, when near an abbey, rang even in the darkness. Matins, lauds, the offices of the night. Though a knight in a castle did not always rise for them, their echo reminded him of the greater order to which he belonged. Even sleep was framed by devotion, by the sense that the struggle against cold was not only physical, but spiritual. The cold, in this sense, became a teacher. To endure it patiently was to imitate Christ's endurance of suffering. To rise early, despite the shivering body's protests, was to discipline the flesh in service of God. In this way, nightly hardship was not wasted, but sanctified. Beyond prayer, there was also the realm of dreams. Medieval people often saw dreams as messages, sometimes divine, sometimes troubling. A knight who shivered into uneasy slumber might awake recalling visions of battles, of angels, of strange beasts. These were not dismissed as mere fancy, but pondered as signs. If a knight dreamt of warmth, of light, of hearths burning bright, it might be taken as reassurance. If he dreamt of frost, of darkness, of fires dying out, it could be seen as warning. Clergy, lords, even fellow knights might interpret these images. Thus the cold nights of the castle extended into the very texture of medieval imagination. While knights sought rest, the castle did not sleep fully. Guards walked the walls, their torches flickering against battlements. Their task was dangerous and weary. Cold could numb the senses, making a man drowsy, less alert. Stories are told of watchmen who dozed at their posts, punished harshly when discovered. For in those hours, the safety of the castle depended on their wakefulness. Here again we see the pattern. The knight's ability to sleep depended on the faithfulness of others. Loyalty was not abstract, but lived in the smallest details. The guard's steady pace, the squire's readiness, the servant's quiet tending of embers. Each act, however small, preserved the fragile security of the castle at night. What then did such knights teach? Perhaps this, that human life in the Middle Ages was not dominated only by great battles or grand feasts, but the slow endurance of small hardships. The knight's honor was forged not only on the field, but in the quiet acceptance of discomfort, the trust in others, the patience to endure. It is easy, from our distance, to imagine knights as figures of steel and glory. Yet in truth, they were men bound by the same needs as all others: warmth, sleep, companionship. The cold stripped away illusion. It revealed dependence, vulnerability, the smallness of human strength before nature's vastness. And in this recognition, perhaps lay the heart of knighthood, not invincibility,
but resilience. Not splendor, but endurance. As the castle lies silent beneath the stars, as fires burn low and frost gathers on the stones, we must ask, what was the true foundation of medieval society? The might of the sword, or the quiet patience of those who endured the night together?
When the night deepened and the castle settled into its slow silence, there was a kind of stillness that pressed itself upon all who lived within the walls. The fires in the great hall would sink into embers, glowing faintly, throwing out more light than warmth. The sound of footsteps on stone grew rare, and the castle's voice changed from the noise of day to the creaks of timber, the distant cry of the wind, and the muffled shuffling of men and women as they sought their places of rest. For the knight, this hour was both comfort and trial. He had armor by day and a place of honor in the hall, but at night the cold stripped him of pretense. He lay in furs and blankets, relying upon the simplest tools of survival, just as the humblest servant did. The preparation for such a night had begun long before the sun had fallen. Servants had gone to and fro with armfuls of firewood, feeding flames until the stone chimneys roared with heat. Women had laid out bedding, stuffing straw into mattresses or shaking out woolen blankets. Cooks had tended stews and breads not only to fill bellies but to give the body strength to fight the cold when the long hours arrived. The knight might appear to sleep in solitude, but his rest was the final product of countless unseen hands. His squire ensured the room was arranged, boots placed neatly by the bed, sword within reach, shield leaning against the wall, for the habit of readiness never left him. Without such care, the night's sleep would have been uneasy, and uneasy sleep could mean poor readiness when morning called. The walls of the chamber did little to keep out the cold. Stone was a poor companion, heavy and unyielding, always colder than the flesh that touched it. That is why the bed itself mattered so much. Great oaken frames supported layers of straw or rush, covered by cloth and thick wool, then overlain with animal pelts, furs from deer, bear, or fox. These were not luxuries in winter, but necessities, for without them the cold crept steadily into bones. A knight would often lie with his undergarments still upon him, linen shirt and woolen hose, for to sleep naked, as some might in warmer months, was unthinkable in the heart of a castle winter. Even the wealthy learned the value of layering cloth upon cloth, one garment trapping what little heat the body produced, while another held the cold at bay. The fire in his chamber, if he was fortunate enough to have one, gave him both light and warmth, but it was a fleeting defense. By midnight, the logs would be reduced to glowing coals. Servants might enter to add more, but the knight would still often wake to see his breath forming in the air. Fingers grew stiff, toes numb, and every movement beneath the covers carried the reminder that warmth was borrowed, never owned. It is in these moments you might imagine the knight pulling the covers tighter, turning his body toward the wall where some faint warmth lingered, or drawing his knees toward his chest to conserve the little heat his own blood could muster. The castle itself seemed to share in the struggle. Its corridors grew dark and silent, its towers wrapped in frost, its gates stiff with ice. Guards moved along the battlements, stamping their feet, blowing into cupped hands, shifting spears from one arm to the other. Their torches flickered, giving brief glimpses of walls whitened with frost. Their task was heavy, but it was the rhythm of their pacing that allowed others to sleep. A knight, lying in his chamber, depended utterly on the men outside. If they failed, if they succumbed to slumber or despair, then no bed was safe. The trust between knight and guard was wordless but deep, built not on comfort but on necessity. In such a night, thoughts grew heavy. The knight might recall battles fought in summers past, when the sun baked armor and sweat stung the eyes. The memory of warmth could itself become a kind of torment, for it reminded the body of what it lacked. He might think of the peasants who dwelt in huts beyond the castle walls, whose lives were harder still. They had no thick walls, no roaring fires, no fur blankets. Their roofs were thatched with straw, their floors bare earth, their beds little more than rough pallets of rush. Yet they endured, and by their endurance the knight endured as well, for they provided the food, the wool, the firewood. The cold reminded him, if he allowed it, of his dependence upon those he commanded. Dreams came slowly, carried by exhaustion rather than comfort. And when they did come, they were filled with symbols that the medieval mind took seriously. A dream of fire could be seen as a blessing, a dream of frost as a warning. The knight might wake in the early hours, disturbed by a vision of dark water or distant voices, and lie still in the half-light, convinced that such things carried meaning. Night was a time when the mind opened to mystery, when the body's weakness made space for thoughts of the divine. As dawn approached, the cold did not soften. In fact, it often deepened, for the last hours before sunrise were the coldest of all. The knight might rise stiffly, his breath white in the air, his feet reluctant to touch the frozen floor. He would reach for garments laid close by, pulling woolen hose higher, fastening a cloak around his shoulders, wrapping his body again before stepping into the day. His rest had been broken, his comfort incomplete, but he had endured. That endurance was its own kind of strength, for every night survived made the next day possible. And so, the cycle repeated itself, night after night, winter after winter. The knight's life, which seemed to outsiders marked by glory and grandeur, was in truth bound to this rhythm of cold and survival. It was not battles alone that tested him, but the long hours when nothing was asked but patience. It was here that his humanity showed most clearly, for stripped of banners and armor, he was simply a man, breathing in the dark, hoping for warmth, longing for the dawn. But we must ask ourselves, as the embers fade and the first birds begin to stir in the frost, what was more defining of his life, the splendor of his deeds by day, or the endurance of the silent night that no chronicler wrote down? Which shaped him more, the clash of swords, or the slow struggle to rest upon a freezing bed?
The last stretch of winter in a medieval castle was often the most difficult. The stores of food that had been carefully laid away in autumn grew thin. Barrels of salted meat dwindled, wheels of cheese hardened with age, and even the grain in the storerooms seemed less plentiful with each passing day. The knight who lay down to sleep on those freezing nights was not only fighting the cold, but also the subtle ache of hunger, for even those of noble rank could not always escape the lean months of February and March. The peasants who lived in the villages beyond the castle walls often suffered far more, but the shadow of scarcity touched every soul in one way or another. And so, when the knight rested, he did so with the knowledge that the world outside his chamber was just as restless as he was. The preparation for sleep became a ritual born of necessity. After the evening meal was cleared away and the hall swept down to quietness, the castle shrank into itself. The knight would retreat to his chamber, led by the flickering glow of torches held by his squire or a servant. The flame revealed damp patches on the stones, the breath of cold mist curling through narrow cracks, and the frost that often painted the glassless windows. He stepped carefully, for floors could be treacherous, and the drafts that seeped into every corridor reminded him that stone, for all its strength, could not keep out winter's grasp. When he reached his bed, the sight of blankets piled high upon the straw mattress was itself a small relief. To the modern mind, it may seem a simple thing, but in those days, to lie down beneath a weight of furs was an act of protection as much as comfort. The body sought warmth where it could. Sometimes the knight shared his bed, not for romance, but for the practical truth that two bodies together held more heat than one. In colder castles, even nobles knew the wisdom of lying close, for the knight did not care about dignity. The thickest cloak, the heaviest blanket, they were all vulnerable to the creeping chill that settled in stone chambers. To draw another's warmth close was not weakness, but survival. The servants, too, huddled in their dormitories, pressed against one another, straw rustling as they turned, blankets pulled as tightly as possible around them. The knight, though higher in station, lived under the same rules of cold as those he commanded. Outside his chamber, the castle kept watch. The guards on the battlements paced steadily, the crunch of their boots echoing softly into the frozen air. Their cloaks snapped in the wind, their torches hissed with sparks, and their voices murmured low to one another, speaking not of glory, but of aching fingers and numb faces. Their presence was the knight's shield while he slept. Though wrapped in fur and lying in a chamber, he could not have rested at all if not for those men who endured the frost in the open air. That knowledge, unspoken, weighed upon him, as did the sound of the distant drawbridge creaking against the pull of the cold river, the iron chains stiff with frost. In the quiet that followed midnight, the knight sometimes turned his thoughts to the chapel, a place that seemed to hold warmth even when its stones were as cold as the rest of the castle. The chapel was not heated, but its silence carried a kind of protection. There, candles flickered at all hours, tended by monks or priests, and prayers were spoken softly in the dark. The knight believed, as many did, that the soul needed as much protection in winter as the body did. Evil was thought to roam more freely in the darkness when men were weak and shivering, when hunger made their thoughts heavy. The act of laying his sword near his bed, within arm's reach, was not only readiness for earthly attack, but also a kind of warding against unseen dangers. To sleep unarmed was to invite weakness, and a knight could not risk that even in his dreams. The hours of night lengthened slowly. Each hour was marked in the castle by the rhythm of guards changing their posts, by the tolling of a small bell in the chapel, by the crackle and collapse of firewood in the hearth. The knight's body shifted restlessly beneath the furs, chasing small patches of warmth, his breath misting into the air with every sigh. When he woke, as he often did, it was not always the cold that disturbed him, but the silence itself, a silence so deep that the faintest sound, a mouse scurrying through rushes, the creak of timber, or the flap of a banner outside, became strangely loud. In that silence, his mind wandered to memories of summer hunts, of fields of green, of the warmth of the sun on armor. Yet every such thought ended with the reminder that he lay not in sunshine, but in the heart of a castle gripped by winter. As dawn began its slow return, the night stirred again. The faintest light crept through narrow windows, pale and weak, yet it signaled the end of the night's trial. Rising from the bed was no small task, for the body resisted, preferring the warmth it had built beneath the furs. But duty called, as it always did. He rose, stretching stiffness from his limbs, pulling on woolen hose, fastening his belt, and drawing his cloak tight. His squire would bring water, often icy and sharp, to wash the face, a shock that pulled him fully into wakefulness. Outside the chamber, servants were already moving, shaking out rushes, tending to fires, sweeping away the remnants of the night. The castle woke slowly, and with it, so did the night. Yet, even as the day began, the memory of the night lingered. It was not forgotten, for it repeated itself endlessly through the season. Each night of endurance left its mark, not in scars like battle, but in the quiet resilience of the spirit. The knight who fought in the hall or upon the field carried with him the lessons of these cold hours, that survival was not always won in combat, but in the patience of lying still, in the discipline of enduring what could not be fought. And so when he stood at the window and looked upon the frost-covered courtyard, he did so not only as a warrior of the day, but as a survivor of the night. But here lies a thought that lingers. When you imagine the life of such a knight, do you picture his shining armor beneath the sun, or do you picture the quiet figure lying in darkness, breath white in the air, listening to the creak of timbers as he waits for dawn? Which of these was the truer shape of his life, and which left the deeper mark upon his soul?
The last part of winter was a season of patience. The knight who lived within the cold walls of a castle had to accept that his body, his spirit, and even his habits were bound to the rhythm of the weather. No matter how fine his armor or how strong his sword arm, he was powerless before the creeping cold. This was perhaps the most humbling truth of those nights, that even those men who rode to battle and commanded respect were, when the torches dimmed, no different from the poorest peasant huddled in a hut beyond the walls. Both sought warmth, both prayed for spring, both endured the long silence of frozen nights. There is something you must imagine clearly. A knight would lie down, surrounded by stone on every side, yet the air inside his chamber was never fully safe from the outside world. Through the smallest cracks and shutters, the wind found its way in. It slipped like invisible fingers over the floor, curled around the bed, and drew the breath from the sleeper's lips in pale mist. Blankets and furs were piled high, but the cold pressed close all the same, pressing its weight on the chest, seeping into the bones, making joints ache before age should have claimed them. For some men, it became so normal that they hardly noticed it after years of repetition. For others, each night was a quiet struggle that left them weary come morning. The knight's dreams in such a place were often shaped by the cold itself. He dreamt of fires that burned hot but could not be reached, of summer hunts in green forests, of feasts where warmth and laughter filled the air. Yet he would wake to find none of it was real, only the dim glow of embers at the hearth and the hush of stone walls. His hand sometimes reached instinctively for the hilt of his sword, resting close by, as though even in sleep he knew the fragility of his world. The sword was cold to the touch, its steel colder than the night, yet it was a reminder of duty, of strength, of a role that continued whether he wished it or not. Around him, the castle had its own rhythm of survival. Servants, wrapped in rough woolen cloaks, rose earlier than their masters, for it was their task to light fires, to sweep the hall, to fetch water from wells that froze at the surface. Their breath plumed before them as they carried buckets and kindling. They suffered the cold far sharply, for their beds were crowded, their blankets thinner, their tasks relentless. Yet without them, the knight could not have lived his life of privilege. The food on his table, the fire in his hearth, the garments folded at his bedside, all were the result of unseen labor, carried out in conditions harsher than his own. He knew it, though he rarely said it. Respect for survival, even in silence, was a shared truth among all who endured this season. There were nights when illness spread easily. Cold chambers did not only chill the body, they weakened it. A fever once caught was far harder to recover from in winter. Physicians spoke of humors and balances, but the truth was that warmth, rest, and nourishment were the only true remedies, and they were not always available. A knight might lie awake listening to the coughs of men in the servants' quarters, the sound echoing through the stone, and know that life was never certain, no matter how strong the walls appeared.
To wake each morning healthy was not taken for granted. It was a quiet blessing, acknowledged in prayer, whispered in the chapel before the day began. There were also the small tricks of endurance, the little acts that made survival possible. Hot stones, heated by the fire and wrapped in cloth, were placed near the feet at night to chase away numbness. Candles were placed close at hand to ward off darkness. Some knights wore woolen caps to bed, a detail that might seem almost humorous to you now, but in truth it was a wise precaution. Heat was lost quickest from the head, and in a chamber where frost clung to the walls, every small measure counted. These were not grand gestures, but they were the details that meant the difference between waking in the morning with life or slipping deeper into illness and despair. When dawn returned, pale and hesitant, it carried with it a subtle relief. The long night was done, at least for a time. The knight would rise, drawing on layers of wool and linen, fastening his cloak, and stepping into boots that were stiff with the cold of the stone floor. He walked with steady patience, aware that the tasks of the day awaited, but always carrying within him the memory of the night just past. The hall would fill again with voices, fires would be stoked high, and food would be placed on the trestle tables. Yet the cold never entirely lifted. It clung to the castle like a shadow, waiting for evening to return, for the cycle to begin again. And so the pattern continued, night after night, season after season, year after year. Some winters were harsher, others more forgiving, but the rhythm was unchanging. Through it, knights learned that endurance was not only about battlefields or crusades. It was about lying still, night after night, beneath heavy blankets, listening to the silence of stone, and accepting that survival could be quiet, slow, and unseen. This truth shaped them as surely as any campaign. It bred patience, resilience, and humility, for even the most armored of men could not command the frost. Now, as you imagine this knight lying down on a straw mattress, softened with linen and heaped with furs, think of the silence that wrapped around him. Think of the way his breath misted into the air, the faint crackle of embers, the creak of timber beams. Think of the castle itself, a vast body of stone holding warmth in its heart, yet forever marked by the cold pressing in from the outside world. Does it not remind you that survival is as much about stillness as it is about strength? That to endure without fanfare, to rise again each morning after a long, cold night, was a victory in itself. And here is the final thought to carry with you into quiet reflection. When we look back upon those men called knights, we often see the shining armor, the battles, the tournaments, the glory sung by chroniclers. But in truth, far more of their lives were spent in moments like these, lying beneath firs in a silent chamber, listening to the sigh of the wind through the shutters, waiting for dawn. The history of their knights was not glorious, but it was real. And it was human. It was the quiet story of endurance. And perhaps that is the truest story of all.